So welcome. This is another session of the Tolpuddle Radical History School online. We do have a number of other sessions throughout the year, which we'll advertise one or two at the end of this session, just so you know. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome our first international speaker, Professor Peter Cole from the University of Western Illinois. He's currently in Chicago. He's not in Illinois at the moment, so I know exactly where he is. Peter's a labor historian. He's written a comparison of Durban, South Africa, and San Francisco. But more importantly for us, he's written about the IWW. And what Peter's going to speak tonight about is the IWW. And Peter, it's a great pleasure for us to have you. And we're so very grateful you got in touch with us. And over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you so much, Les and Nigel, and everyone with the Tolpuddle Radical History School. It's an honor to be with you this evening. I'm going to share my screen because the slideshow I created is more interesting to look at than me. And maybe you'll see back from me in 30 or 35 minutes or so. So I'm here to talk to you this evening about a man named Ben Fletcher, who was the most important leader of the industrial workers of the world's most effective interracial labor union, which controlled the Philadelphia waterfront for a decade due to its militancy and direct action tactics. Fletcher, the widely acknowledged leader of that union, was one of the most important Black labor figures in US history, yet very few people, even on those who identify as the left, even know his name. However, I'd like to suggest to you that he couldn't be more important to many of the most urgent projects of our time. Excuse me. I placed Ben Fletcher squarely at the center of labor union organizing in the early 20th century. And that meant dealing with the ever entwined dynamics of what we sometimes call race and class, not to mention the potentials and limits of direct action versus bread and butter unionism in an interracial and then later predominantly Black labor union. Simply put, Ben Fletcher was the leader of the union in the United States in a time when racism and xenophobia were rampant. That Ben Fletcher, a Black man, led a union that was both multi-ethnic and multiracial is shocking and an incredibly rare instance. Now in our time, 2021, racism, xenophobia, and inequality, of course, continue. Arguably worse in 100 years ago, 120 years ago. But this is a story that I hope you find most interesting, but also sort of quite educational and meaningful. Yeah, so I'll begin by talking a little about who Ben Fletcher was as a individual. Born in Philadelphia, an African-American. His parents had moved to Philadelphia from the state of Virginia to the South just a few years prior. Why they moved, why Ben Fletcher's parents moved separately to Philadelphia in the 1880s, not certain. But in that era, after the era known in America as Reconstruction, which was the era right after the Civil War when African-Americans both won their freedom, but also sort of gained equal rights. After Reconstruction, although it took 15 to 20 years or so, a new system of race relations emerged, often nicknamed in the United States Jim Crow, a sort of slang term to describe racial segregation. And so what we're seeing in the late 1800s in many states, including Virginia, is sort of surging racism and violence perpetrated against Black people who only recently had won their freedom and equal rights. And so this image actually is a classic painting from the 1920s describing the so-called Great Migration of African Americans out of the South into the Northeast and the Midwest. So this painting it's a visual sort of rendering of what we might think about. Fletcher's parents were one of many African Americans who were starting to leave the South, right, due to sort of the pervasive racism in the places where they had lived. Fletcher's father came from an area known as the Eastern Shore of Virginia, which is this peninsula off the coast, off the Atlantic Ocean side, the east side of the state of Virginia. Eastern Shore is also sort of, has a historic connection to maritime trades, fishing, sailing, and others. And so it's actually quite reasonable to conclude that Fletcher's father might have also been a maritime worker of some sort, maybe a docker, maybe working on ships. We can't be sure. But we know, for example, that on the Maryland Eastern Shore, Frederick Douglass, that's where he lived and that's where he escaped from. And he escaped, Frederick Douglass, the most well-known African-American of the 19th century, actually, used a boat in order to escape from slavery in the 1830s. And another famous African-American who freed herself from slavery, Sojourner Truth, also lived in this area, right? And so really this region has deep connections to the water, really to the ocean. And so it's not surprising in a way that maybe Ben Fletcher, that is, became a docker himself. His parents were born in the 1850s, and we know almost nothing about them. But almost all African Americans in that era who were from the South actually were enslaved. And so it's reasonable to conclude that his parents were as well, although he never talked about it. And actually, it's one of the many gaps in our knowledge about Fletcher, even though we know so much and we might be impressed. In a way, I'd like to know a whole lot more. When Fletcher's family moved to Philadelphia, and then Fletcher born in 1890, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Philadelphia actually had the largest Black population in the US outside of the South. And even though many Black people lived in Philadelphia relatively, racism really defined the Black experience. The famous African-American writer and scholar and intellectual and activist W.E.B. Du Bois wrote his first book while living in Philadelphia in the 1890s called the Philadelphia Negro. And he basically sort of broke down that for Black men and Black women, especially on the job, that the racism basically radically limited one's opportunities. Philadelphia also, as the third largest city in the country at that time, and a mighty, mighty industrial city that produced everything from battleships to button hooks, was very well known also as being very anti-union, nicknamed by one labor organizer as a scab town and another as the graveyard of unionism. In this era, in the early 1900s, Ben Fletcher, who did not graduate from high school, started working in his teens, which would have been very common for working class Americans. Actually, the majority didn't graduate from high school at that time, and the majority of African Americans did not either. Fletcher, therefore, was already trying to sort of basically earn money, maybe in his mid-teens, right? In Philadelphia, a physically small city, it would have been actually quite easy for Fletcher to walk, say, a mile or less from his home to the Delaware River, which is the east side of the city of Philadelphia, which is where basically there would have been dozens and dozens of ships anchored, loading and unloading cargo, raw materials coming off boats from the coast and from the Caribbean, finished products being loaded onto ships, right? It's also in this era that Fletcher joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, as well as the Socialist Party of America. And in that time, it was quite common for radicals, people who identified as radicals, to join the IWW, hundreds of thousands would, but also to join the SP, the Socialist Party. Remember, the Communist Party does not exist, wouldn't exist until after World War I. How and why and precisely when Fletcher joined, we're not certain, probably around 1910. It's not inconceivable that he actually was simply walking down the street in his working class neighborhood and saw a person speaking on a street corner, nicknamed the soapbox speaker. For you would stand on a small wooden box in order to be above the crowd, in order to sort of appeal to people. This is before radio, before TV, before the internet. Print media was the only source of mass communication, and it was quite common for organizations of all sorts, charitable, political, radical, union, to actually try to meet people where they were literally, which was to be on streets, right? Of course, I don't have to tell this to folks in England. London's Hyde Park is a legendary place where soapbox speakers also would have gathered. That's the same in the United States, right, in this era. Now, what was this union that Fletcher joined, the Industrial Workers of the World? Let me tell you some about this. So the IWW was actually founded in the city of Chicago, which was the second largest city in the country and its greatest industrial city, arguably the greatest industrial city in the world in the early 20th century, and where I happen to be right now, happily. And I am just a few miles north of actually where several hundred radicals, socialists, anarchists, and revolutionaries met in 1905 on May Day in order to found the Industrial Workers of the World. Yeah. Why did they want to form this organization? Well, in that era, capitalism dominated the United States. The government was incredibly small, and there was literally zero laws that existed to regulate corporations, right? Corporations totally dominated. A small group of capitalists dominated the wealth and of the country, and the government would do the bidding of these corporations, regularly dispatching the US Army and more typically the police in order to sort of break unions and weaken or break strikes. The working class was very weak as well. The most unions that existed, there were not many, were affiliated with what's called the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. But the AFL chose not to organize most women workers, chose not to organize most Black workers, chose not to organize most immigrant workers, chose not to organize many so-called unskilled workers, which is to say that the AFL chose not to organize most workers. Right? The AFL was committed to craft unionism, a small slice of relatively skilled workers, sometimes called the aristocrats of labor, and only really were interested in protecting the wages and benefits of its members, right? And so basically, those who were the great majority of workers couldn't be in the AFL. And the IWW wanted to organize all workers, regardless of the sort of work they do, into industrial unions as opposed to craft or trade unions, right? Because corporations were national and even global. And so therefore, why would you possibly form 20 unions in a single corporation with 20 different interests when for workers, in the IWW sense, should be united, right? The IWW, as it was often called, was explicitly anti-capitalist from its inception, wanted to sort of destroy capitalism and fashioned itself as an anti-nationalist as well. It was actually proposed at its founding convention here in Chicago that it be named the Industrial Workers of America, and it was voted down in favor of the Industrial Workers of the World, right? Like, why? Well, one, because the argument was that socialism is really an internationalist vision, but also that capitalism was, regardless of what you think, right? That corporations operate on a global scale, right? And in fact, there's no global law, right? And so corporations pit countries against each other, but also that nationalism was a false path, right? This was, of course, a common view among socialists, although not all socialists embrace these values, right? And as you may know, members of the IWW were and still are affectionately known as Wobblies. Wobbly shared much in common with other socialists, most particularly and importantly, rejecting capitalism for being so unfair to so many human beings. This classic IWW poster from 1911 explains it better than I can, right? Like the many literally support the few, right? To the benefit of the few and to the detriment of the many. And that is why the Wobblies also embraced a motto, which it became famous for: an injury to one is an injury to all. Honestly, if there's a more commonsensical one sentence slogan that explains working class unity, I don't know what it is, right? Many unions subsequently have adopted this slogan, right, because of its power, including around the world. And so I study a lot about South Africa, as Les mentioned, and there's actually most of the trade unions in South Africa use this motto in their banners and sort of propaganda as well. Now, in Philadelphia specifically, the IWW organized because the Philadelphia waterfront, because that waterfront workforce was incredibly diverse. Yeah. And so in Philadelphia, the thousands of men, and at that time it was only men, who loaded and unloaded ships were 1/3 African-American approximately, 1/3 Irish and Irish-American approximately, and 1/3 immigrants from other European countries. Think Italy, Poland, Russia, and the like, right? The AFL didn't know what to do with these sorts of unions. The IWW mocked the AFL and nicknamed it the American separation of labor, right, for dividing workers by craft, but also because they often ignored intentionally Black and female workers, as well as many immigrants, right? It's not surprising, therefore, that a union like the IWW might be appealing to the waterfront workers in Philadelphia. It's arguable also that only a union like the IWW could have done so. Right, and in 1913, with Ben Fletcher already a leader in Philadelphia in the IWW chartered a branch in the Marine Transport Workers Industrial Union of the IWW named Local 8. Now, before I talk about Local 8 any further, I do always like to give a pitch to, as a maritime historian and a historian of maritime labor, the centrality of shipping. Today, yes, 90% of the goods that you consume, whoever you are, wherever you live, have been moved at least part of their journey by ship. That's in the 21st century, right? But shipping, of course, precedes capitalism. Trade precedes capitalism, right? But really, the rise of capitalism, the rise of shipping as the most important industry in the country and world, the rise of imperialism are all linked to the ship, right? It's only because of the ship, right, that Spain, Portugal, and later France, Holland, the UK, and others came to dominate the world for basically half a millennium, right? Like it both was explain the rise of empire. I'm mindful of speaking to the British, right? Like as well as the rise of capitalism, and those two things are intertwined as well. Now, some of you may know, but some of you probably don't. And I appreciate this is maybe my best story, right? Like it was in 1768 in London, then the greatest port in the world, right? That a group of sailors who wanted to raise took down the sails of their ship, which is to say they stopped work, right? Because workers then understood, and workers now hopefully understand, that workers' greatest power is to strike, that is to stop work, right? That word is a nautical term. To take down the sails of a ship is to strike the sails, right? And that term, to strike the sail, became the de facto term used in English to describe all labor stoppages ever since, right? Like that also tells us the centrality of maritime to capitalism, right? That the very word that is workers' greatest power is a maritime term. Now, on the Philadelphia waterfront, like in cross-American ports, but also I know for a fact, because I read a little English labor history too, right? In London and other ports in the UK, as well as in other places, the hiring process was called a casual process, because you would have to basically, if you wanted a job loading or unloading ships, you would go down to the waterfront, maybe to a specific pier or wharf, and at certain times of day or night in order to be picked. In the US, that was called the shape up. And workers hated this system. So imagine 300 workers show up for 50 jobs, right? Like, and the employer, the hiring boss, picks and chooses. Who does that boss hire? Well, maybe their friends, maybe someone who's of the same race, maybe someone who's of the same religion, maybe someone who's from the same neighborhood, maybe someone who's offered a bribe, maybe some combination of those things. But the effect of that is that what you have is this huge labor surplus, which drives down wages, right, and weakens workers, right? But it also pits workers against each other, right? So that you see your fellow workers as your competition rather than as your allies, right? Who wins in that scenario? The boss wins, right? Like that was widely understood. The question is, do workers have the power to change that, right? Now, if you do get hired for dock work, heavy manual labor, very dangerous. Literally every day you walk onto the job, you could die, right? I knew that when I logged on to this event this afternoon that I wasn't going to die doing it, right? My work is not so dangerous, right? Like by contrast, dock work is incredibly dangerous. Who's going to protect you? Not the boss, that's for sure, right? It's only your fellow workers, right? Like they know that they could die, they know you could die. Right? Who's going to look out for you when that sling of cargo might bust? Your fellow worker, right? Workers understood that this was dangerous work. That bonds people in the same way that fighting an army bonds people, right? Literally, it's danger, actually, that is what uniting people, not fighting on behalf of a flag, right? Arguably, it's sort of that common experience of danger, but also that you have to literally work with each other in groups in order to sort of get the job done. This work is hard. It was not uncommon for shifts to work 12 hours, 16 hours, 24 hours or longer. Why? Because the ship must sail on time. Why? Because time is money. These popular slogans actually explain very clearly sort of some of the keys to this industry, which of course is as appropriate today as in the 20th century, right? Like if I'm thinking about when my mother tells me about Amazon is going to deliver goods to her in 2 hours, right? That means that workers actually are sort of under the gun to sort of work as fast as possible, right? Like, and so that's the sort of the world of work. I could talk much longer about this, but you get the idea. I do want to highlight one other point about the work that these done is that this work was gang labor. It was common for workers to work in, say, gangs of 15 or 20 men. There might be 5 to 8 gangs on a single ship, right? Like, and you often actually worked in pairs, right? And so the nature of that work actually develops a collective identity, right? We need each other in order to accomplish our common goal, right? We also see each other as ally, and we see the boss as the enemy. No dock worker becomes a ship captain, right? No dock worker ends up owning a shipping corporation, right? There is no chance for mobility in this sort of occupation. It is very much us and them, which very much fits into the IWW motto, or creed that I told you about. In their preamble, the first sentence says, employers and workers share nothing in common, right? And so what we have here is a class conscious organization, but in an industry that actually inculcates class consciousness on the job, even if you don't have a union, right? It is us versus them. Yeah, that of course also is potentially power, especially if you combine that identity with the nature of the work. And so in the spring of 1913, dock workers in Philadelphia shut down the port for several weeks. Hundreds of ships can't move because of the work stoppage. It's during this time that Local 8 is chartered. It's during this time that Ben Fletcher, of course, becomes the leader of this union, and really changes the nature, well, of his life, but also sort of the city for the next decade or so. Local 8 won that strike. They won a raise. They won union recognition, not in a written contract, but verbally, which I'll talk more about. And they immediately started to exert power in ways that were quite interesting, and which I'm going to highlight again, focusing on Fletcher. So first and foremost, it was the bosses who had created segregation. Gangs worked in racially and ethnically segregated groups, a Black gang, a Polish gang, an Irish gang. That was just another way that bosses were able to foment differences and divisions among the workers, right? The union understood this. It's, again, not rocket science, and the IWW already had developed these sort of concepts. And so the workers basically integrated themselves. I sometimes refer to this as integration from below, as opposed to integration coming from above, i.e. those with power. What we've got is working class people forcing the bosses to integrate, right? So suddenly gangs are no longer racially and ethnically homogenous, right? Then after we do that, if we are in this union, what happens? We start to maybe learn about each other a bit more. And maybe we learn that actually that Black guy and that Irish guy are not so different from each other, right? Maybe in fact they have a common interest, maybe many. Maybe they even become friends, right? Like social events were integrated. The leadership ranks were by bylaws within the local mandated racially mixed leadership. In other words, African Americans in certain positions, whites in others, right? And so what we see is basically this union in 1913 is what now we would call anti-racist. That term wasn't really used then, but now I would use that term to describe it, right? And in the United States, for those of you who are unfamiliar with its history, it would not be until 1964, 51 years later, that the federal government officially ended legal segregation in the United States. So 50 years before the government said that we should do this, this union did it for themselves, right? They also abolished the shape-up. The shape-up, as I mentioned, was hated by workers for the reasons I earlier explained. Employers no longer could command workers to go to every pier, say at 8 in the morning, in order to get picked for jobs, or at 8 at night. Now, the employers would call up the union hall. Phones existed, landlines, we would call them now. And an employer would say, we want, say, 100 guys to come to Pier 13 tomorrow morning to, I don't know, load textiles onto that ship, right? Like, and the union dispatched its members, right? They did so on an equitable but also anti-racist basis. So no longer would you have to bribe someone in order to get a job, right? And no longer would you be discriminated against based upon who you happen to be, right? Membership dues were very low, but each month, and this was common in many industries, right? In many places, you'd get a new button each month if you had paid your dues. Some of them featured here. Some nowadays spend hundreds of dollars on eBay to buy these things. I don't, because I don't have that sort of money for a button. But I appreciate that some are collectors, right? These buttons also were able to tell people within the union who was active and sort of loyal, right? So that if an employer who always wanted to destroy the union might hire someone who was not paid up, or even some non-union members, workers could see and then sort of take action, which I'll talk more about in a second. The union also started to implement some holidays because to working all day is sort of a bummer. Let's take some days off. And so on the first anniversary of their birth, which is actually this week, right? And so I'm speaking to you, it was May 14th, 1913 that they were born, right? Like that they declared an annual strike, right? The first time they announced this, employers said, if you don't come to work in the morning, don't come back in the afternoon. By the evening, employers were asking the workers to come back to do a night shift because they had not been able to intimidate the workers, right? To deny them their celebration. Another important detail about the IWW generally, including Local 8, was that the IWW refused to sign contracts. Most union contracts, including in the United States particularly, have a so-called no strike clause, right? So for the duration of the contract, you can't strike. To the IWW, that's basically sacrificing workers' greatest power, and so therefore it should not be sacrificed, right? And so an oral agreement existed on an annual basis, and workers might use their power maybe regularly in order to sort of push higher wages, but maybe safer workplace, maybe to fire non-union members, maybe to sort of to protest against a racist boss, etc. This often is referred to as direct action, although that term means many things to many people, but that's, I think, the way it's generally used in the IWW context. Sabotage, another controversial term, was very popular in the IWW as a term. It generally meant actually slowing down, sometimes called working to rule. Basically doing, why sort of work so hard? You know, if you make a dime and your boss makes $1, right? Maybe it would be better actually if you slowed down, right? Like, and so the IWW very intentionally implemented and tried to radicalize its members. And the IWW would also spread these ideas around the world. And so it was often sailors, but sometimes migrants who would travel, right, to various places. And within a few years of the formation of the IWW in 1905, there were already branches in Canada and Mexico, as well as in Australia and New Zealand, south of Mexico, in the Caribbean and in South America, eastwards in Europe, in Ireland, in the UK, on mainland Europe, but also as far south as Southern Africa, and even had connections to people in Japan and India. I'm highlighting their classic Little Red Songbook in Finnish on the left, but also this photograph I love on the right of a mine worker union in New Zealand in the IWW. It was in the IWW that they also were anti-racist. The first predominantly English white union that actually had a column in its national newspaper, written in Maori for Maori working class people in the sheep and mining industries, right? Like, so it's not just in the U.S. that the IWW tried to organize all workers regardless of color or race, but also in other places. In Philadelphia, so too, Ben Fletcher, who was often a leader in Local 8, was very well known in the IWW for being a great speaker. And so he was regularly dispatched to other ports up and down the Atlantic coast: Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, New York, Baltimore, Maryland, Norfolk, Virginia, and the like. And so Fletcher was in Philadelphia, generally his home, but it was in early 1917 that he was in Norfolk, Virginia, his parents' home state, where he was threatened with a lynching. He was harassed while he was speaking on the Norfolk waterfront. He was questioned about the interracial nature of the IWW, and he responded sort of famously, but then his friends smuggled him out on a ship, got him away from Norfolk to Boston. In this era, dozens of Black men every year were being murdered, right, for being Black across the country, not just in the South, but particularly in the South, right? And so Fletcher experienced that danger. My book, Ben Fletcher, actually is, the majority of the book are original documents written by Fletcher or about Fletcher during his life, or people who knew him. So my book is a sort of a introductory long biography, 80 pages, and then several hundred pages of documents that I introduce. And so one of my, I think my favorite document is an interview Fletcher did in 1931, where he described being nearly lynched in Norfolk, Virginia, and escaping with his life, ending up in Boston, which was where he started to be surveyed by the US federal government. It was in Boston that Fletcher was living when the United States declared war in 1917, joining the war that called World War I, although I always tell my students, really, this was a European war. It's just since Europe was so powerful, they called it World War I, right? Like, but like, you know, the US enters the war officially 3 years into the war, right? Almost immediately, the federal government started to target the IWW, which was the largest radical union in the United States, right? The US Congress passed the Espionage Act, later also supplemented by the Sedition Act, that basically criminalized dissent. And the IWW, like many left-wing organizations, had been critical of the European war and critical of European workers for fighting against each other instead of fighting the boss. This was, of course, a critique made by socialists across Europe, although, as we know, most European socialists ended up voting with their nations and abandoning internationalism in favor of nationalism, right? So that British and French workers were killing German and Austrian workers and so on, right? The IWW in America was sort of critical of that, and those words were used against them in their printed publications by the US federal government. Fletcher and hundreds of other Wobblies were arrested in 1917 and 1918 and put on federal trial. The largest of these trials was in Chicago, Illinois. In 1918, Fletcher was among this national sort of trial. This was actually the longest trial in the history of the US up until this time, and this was a nationally covered trial, right? And Chicago being the headquarters of the IWW, but also the second biggest city. Fletcher and these other Wobblies were in Cook County Jail, sort of a notorious place where the Haymarket martyrs actually had been imprisoned decades prior, during the spring and summer of 1918, right? Fletcher, during this trial, starts to become well known beyond his friend circle for being really funny, right? One time he turns to his fellow Wobbly defendant, Big Bill Haywood, during the trial and says, you know, if it wasn't for me, there'd be no color at all in this trial, since he was the only African-American among the defendants. After 4 months, the jury went out to discuss 100 people on 5 counts each, and came back in under an hour and basically found all 100 of them guilty on all counts, right? Fletcher turns to Haywood once more when the sentences are being read, and Fletcher says, the judge's grammar isn't very good, Bill. And Haywood says, how's that, Ben? He's like, well, his sentences are much too long. In fact, Fletcher had been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Wobblies were sentenced from anywhere from 5 to 20 years, sentenced anywhere from $10,000 to $40,000 in fines. This is 1918 dollars, right? Like, and so Fletcher will be sent along with nearly 100 other Wobblies on a special train from Chicago to Leavenworth, Kansas, in eastern Kansas, near Kansas City, which is where, at that time, the only federal prison was located. This image, and it's also on the cover of my book, is sort of when he was being incarcerated and processed in late 1918. Leavenworth was a fascinating place in this time because this is where the federal government was throwing in all sorts of people who are anti-war: communists, anarchists, socialists, Wobblies, pacifists, religious objectors, right? So-called common criminals and the like. Now, Fletcher didn't say much about his time in prison, but another famous radical who was sort of friends with many Wobblies and himself a Mexican anarchist and revolutionary named Ricardo Flores Magón wrote extensively about his time in Leavenworth. Magón described being in Leavenworth as follows. He was caught by the formidable mechanism of a monstrous machine, and my flesh may get ripped open, and my bones crushed, and my moans fill the space and make the very infinite shudder. But the machine will not stop grinding and grinding and grinding. Fletcher, like many others, wrote to friends, family, fellow Wobblies, and other radicals. And it is ironic that as a historian, that much of the evidence that I have in my book comes from federal documents, right? And so they basically read all his correspondence and took notes about his correspondence in and out, as they would have for all political prisoners at this time, right? And so in one letter that Fletcher wrote to a socialist friend of his in Milwaukee, on New Year's Eve, 1920, just before 1920. He wrote to her, among other lines, "We are living in momentous times. None of us are gifted with the power of clairvoyancy as to be able to foretell the day or the hour. Therefore, the first and most important duty is for all of us to prepare for the final chapter in the life of capitalism." And so even while in prison, clearly his politics had not changed, right? He remained committed very much to his cause, as did most every other Wobbly. outside in Philadelphia, actually, back on the waterfront, Local 8, even though 6 of its leaders, not just Fletcher, but 5 others as well, had been arrested and imprisoned or deported by the US federal government, Local 8 still held on to power, right? And so the next wave of leaders rose up. And even though the union had been, its leadership sort of, you might say, the head chopped off, it sprouted a second head like a hydra, right? And held on, although weakened, very much weakened by the loss of Fletcher and some of its other leaders. For the sake of time, I sort of don't go into too much depth about that. I actually wrote my dissertation and first book called Wobblies on the Waterfront about Local 8. And then this book, Ben Fletcher, is sort of focuses on this most prominent of its members, Ben Fletcher, particularly. In late 1922, employers sensing that the tide had turned, lockout its workers, which is to say that they basically, it's an employer strike. I think of the 1913 Dublin Lockout as another example of that sort, from maybe closer to home for you guys. Shipping corporations had big help from the AFL-L's dock worker union, had help from the city government, which supplied plenty of police, had help from the federal government, which literally brought up strikebreakers from the South in order to sort of further weaken Local 8. And Local 8, which had basically controlled the waterfront workforce for nearly a decade, no longer could do so. And by 1923, Local 8 was no longer in power. Even still, the sort of a famous Black socialist magazine published in New York City still considered Fletcher to be the most prominent Negro labor leader in America the following year. Fletcher had gotten out of prison, as did most Wobblies, by the end of 1922. So his sentence had been commuted, and Fletcher and others would later be pardoned by FDR in 1933. Philadelphia dock workers later chose to join the AFL-L's dock worker union, which is called the International Longshoremen's Association. And that ILA chapter branch still exists in Philadelphia, although Philadelphia is now a much, much smaller port than it used to be. In the same way that London is no longer a port, so too Philadelphia is really no longer a meaningful port. Many of my English friends don't even know the name of the port that actually is where most cargo comes in and out of England, right? But in case you don't know, it's called Felixstowe, right? It's on the east coast of England, and it is what London was for centuries, right? The sort of the mightiest port in on your island. Dock workers in Philadelphia in the ILA were able to sort of get an 8-hour day, but unfortunately the ILA was, and I would say to this day, sadly, is very undemocratic. And so the IWW was, in my opinion, a far better union for its members. The ILA also allowed the shape up to return, allowed gangs to be resegregated. And these two institutions, segregated gangs and the shape up, remained in place until the early 1970s, right? And so for these dock workers in Philadelphia, I'm suggesting that actually their lives were better in many material ways in the 19-teens than they would be for decades to come. For Black people in particular, waterfront work and the waterfront neighborhoods, for that matter, became far more dangerous places. The IWW remained anti-racist, as this sort of amazing poster from the 1920s suggests, right? But Local 8 no longer was in any way powerful. Fletcher would move to New York City in the early 1930s, where he married, or I should say remarried, around that time. And he and his wife lived in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood called Bedford-Stuyvesant, sometimes nicknamed Bed-Stuy, although Bed-Stuy is now considered sort of well-known. Spike Lee, for instance, is from that neighborhood. It wasn't all Black before World War II. It later became more segregated and more concentrated Black. But Fletcher was, like many working class men, especially those who worked in dangerous trades, really weak. He had a major stroke in his mid-40s, which is very young to have a major stroke. He sort of lingered on, conscious, but not sort of able to support himself. His wife was the primary breadwinner in their later years, and died in 1949, buried in Brooklyn in an unmarked grave. Although there's actually a group of us in New York and other parts of the US who are actively seeking to sort of basically raise funds in order to sort of and get permission from the cemetery to create a prominent monument to Fletcher in Brooklyn, but also later we hope to do something similar in Philadelphia. To conclude, Fletcher was a fascinating figure in my opinion. I hope you agree. He believed in the working class, and he believed in the working class capacity to win socialism. He never wavered from his belief that capitalism would end. but that it would only be when an organized working class through unions would be able to basically overcome the system of capitalism, but also to overcome racism and xenophobia. He was not naive, he was not a blind optimist, but he very much remained committed to the ideals that he had embraced as in his late teens till his dying days. I very much appreciate the opportunity to sort of speak to you this evening, and thanks especially to Les and Nigel for making this possible. And if there are any comments or questions, it's my pleasure to talk to you folks more now. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much, Peter. That was excellent. Really, really good. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I think you've just given us a quick race through some history of unionism on the waterfront in Philadelphia, which I thought was excellent, really. When you talk about the IWW being organized in terms of gangs, and you put that slide up about a third of the workers were black, a third were Irish, and a third were other immigrants, you know, were there not tension between those groups that the IWW had to deal with? And how did it deal with that tension? Because it clearly came over in your talk as a very non-racist organization.
So that's an important question, and I appreciate being asked. And the answer is that I can't give you a great answer. I can give you, I hope, a good answer. We don't know what people think, right? I don't know what you're thinking, and you probably don't know what I'm thinking. I say that it's even harder to try to figure out what 5,000 men 100 years ago who didn't leave any documents behind thought, right? And so therefore, I hesitate to tell people what really people thought in their hearts and minds. We can judge actions, right? That's a little easier, right? And so we know the gangs were integrated. Was there resistance? I assume there was, right? But ultimately, the leadership, if not the membership, was able to sort of implement these changes. And I'd like to think, because this union was able to maintain the support of its members for actually years, that came to be understood as sort of necessary, if not necessarily attractive. Although it also, I believe that over time, it's reasonable to conclude that more people came to believe in this, right? So I'll give you an example from 1921, 8 years after they were formed. In Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, a terrible race massacre occurred in which about 300 Black men and women were murdered by white people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, basically for being Black, right? And in the summer of that happened in this month, 100 years ago, right? In June of 1921, in Local 8, they held a meeting to talk about the Tulsa Race Massacre. The idea that a predominantly white organization, which the IWW was at the national level, would have held an event to talk about what just had happened with hundreds, maybe thousands of working class people, in and of itself is interesting. The evidence comes from this Black magazine called The Messenger, which had someone at this meeting, right? And they report about how both Black and white people in the audience who are members of Local 8 sort of criticized what had happened, blamed the Ku Klux Klan, which was not actually maybe the primary driver, but it's the most well-known racist organization in the country, right? But also sort of noted that segregated gangs and segregated unions would be detrimental to them, right? And so at least some people at that meeting, who of course had to have chosen to attend such a meeting, right, were very clear that this sort of racial divisions were weakened workers, and that they had to sort of commit to racial equality, right? Of course, this was also in a magazine that was sympathetic to those ideas too, right? And so we have to be mindful of where we can get information, right? But there's no evidence that I've ever found that sort of suggests otherwise, it contradicts that, right? And so I think the evidence that exists is actually pretty clear that this union worked hard to sort of fight against racism and xenophobia. But, the fact that ultimately a generation on that, these sort of forces sort of weaken the union and destroy it are evidence that those forces weren't overcome. Of course, it's a little much to ask maybe these couple thousand guys to do what 100 million people in the country are doing, right? But anyway, these are some of the issues. I think that's actually one of the most important. So your question is really important. These are the issues that we need to be thinking about, right? And so,
yeah. Okay, so Paul has written in, can any comparisons be made to the life work of Paul Robeson?
So Paul Robeson, to my knowledge, didn't know anything about Local 8, although Robeson did live his final years, many of his final years in Philadelphia, not so far from where Ben Fletcher would have been generations earlier, right? So Robeson's politics are very anti-racist, very pro-union, as well as being pro-socialist. In this way, Robeson, who, was alive then, but a young man, right, lived much longer. Robeson, I think, would have been very sympathetic to the story of Local 8. But to my knowledge, there's no direct connection, even though geographic and political are sort of share, overlap a great deal. And really, starting in the 30s and especially in the 40s, Robeson often spoke at union gatherings, not just in the US, but as you know, in Scotland and other parts of the UK, in England, in Australia. I wish I had some evidence that Robeson was aware of Local 8 and Ben Fletcher. I don't, even though it's a logical, the comparison, it makes sense. It's tantalizing.
Thanks for that. Andy Lidington's written in, what a marvelous talk, thank you so much. Did the IWW have any sort of relationship with the International Transport Workers Federation, which was also seeking to organize in a global context in the late 19th century?
That's a great question. So the ITF, so the IWW didn't belong to the International Transport Workers Federation. That organization exists now. It represents workers in, say, trucking, in rail, as well as in shipping, transportation. Although it originated actually in England among sailors and dock workers in the late 19th century in order to basically prevent shipping corporations from destroying strikes, say, in England by bringing in strike breakers from, say, the mainland, right, from, say, Belgium or France or the Netherlands, right? And so it's actually geographically appropriate question and time-wise too. The ITF isn't a union, however, in the sense that it doesn't represent workers in specific contracts, right? Because there's labor law varies by country, and shipping corporations actually often fly these flags of convenience. So they put all their ships in very anti-union countries. The ITF is a wonderful organization that tries to represent the interests of transport workers, coordinating them across countries in ways that are so important, especially for trade. I think it's very noteworthy that the first international worker organization of this sort in an industry was in maritime, in shipping, right? And is, to my knowledge, actually the most significant still in the 21st century. And that has been based, I think, forever in England, actually. I've wanted to do research in the ITF archives, but never have. But the IWW was more expressly anti-capitalist, and so wasn't interested in sort of playing, if you will, with shipping corporations in order to reform the system, because the IWW believed in revolutionary change, which obviously they failed to achieve, but nevertheless were committed to, right? So I think that's a great question about the ITF.
Can I take you back to his sentence in Leavenworth? You said Leavenworth was the only federal prison at that time, and obviously he's transported a long way to get there. When he was there, and you described the breaking down, the Mexican leader, whose name I've already forgotten, I'm sorry, was saying it was a breaking down of his body and his soul, basically. Were they faced with manual labor, stone breaking? Were they taken out in gangs to work out in the fields? What sort of experiences did Fletcher have in Leavenworth itself, which I've always thought was a particularly hard prison. I don't know why I've got that idea in my mind, but I think of it as being a pretty dreadful place to be sent to.
That's a good question. So, like most in America, like most people who are prisoners are actually in violating local or state laws, and so most prisons actually are state prisons or county prisons, not federal. So far fewer criminals, if you will, are sentenced at the federal level, right? Leavenworth was the only prison, but because so many people were going to run into prison, they sometimes put people in state prisons, including the most famous World War I prisoner, Eugene Debs. He was put to a state prison in West Virginia and then into a newly constructed prison in Atlanta, which is where Debs ran for president in 1920 famously. He had been transferred to a federal pen in Georgia, right? Like, as for Leavenworth, what we know is limited again, but So yeah, so prisoners would have had to do work, although work was considered a so-called privilege. And we know that Fletcher was punished for a series of infractions 5 or 6 times, put into solitary, had sort of social activities restricted and whatnot. But I don't think he suffered necessarily more than most, right? Prisoners in general were. There was dozens, if not hundreds of wobblies and other radicals. And so they organized sort of educational groups and whatnot. Fletcher as a Black man would have probably suffered more from the guards than most, although there's no evidence of that, but it's reasonable to conclude, right? The prisons in America weren't nearly as harsh as maybe the prisons that people in England might be familiar with, like for instance, on Robben Island in South Africa, where Mandela and others were sort of breaking big rocks into small ones and whatnot. And so, but there were sort of incidences, these are sort of sketchy, right, where so-called common criminals, right, murderers or others who might also be in prison who don't have a political agenda, perhaps, might be used against the political prisoners to sort of provoke fights and whatnot. And there's some evidence that that occurred, as well as sort of playing race as possible. The Wobblies generally on the inside were good, as well as on the outside, in terms of Fletcher was a friend of everybody's in the IWW, but so there's little bits of evidence about these matters. Fletcher did write to people, but he never talked about his conditions, right? In those letters, at least those that I've seen, right? Leavenworth is notorious, as you said, usually because the people who are sent there are considered bad people, right? Like Al Capone, or right, some gangsters and the like. But I call these folks political prisoners, even though the Wobblies weren't. They didn't have a political party, right? But a lowercase p, they were there for their beliefs, really, as opposed to committing any real crime. I mean, to say that you're anti-war, well, in 1918, that could, if you were in the IWW and you said that actually was cause for being in prison, right? A lot of people believe that violated the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees the freedom of speech, which essentially means the freedom of thought. Yeah, and that's why after the war ended, although it still took 2 to 3 years, most of these prisoners had their sentences commuted.
Okay, Andy's come back with another question. How successful was Fletcher in organizing seafarers in his time?
So there's actually a case in 1920 during a big strike in Philadelphia where there were sailors who were affiliated with what was called the British Shop Stewards movement, which is very similar in its sort of politics to the IWW, where during a strike, for instance, these sailors would basically refuse to work. So like if the dock workers are on strike, the ship captain would try to get the sailors to do the work, right? Like sometimes they might, sometimes they not. There are very interesting examples of solidarity between sailors, including those who worked in what was called the engine rooms, where they had to shovel coal in order to sort of power the ship, right? Like basically refusing to work, basically denying power literally to the ship. And a lot of those engine room workers were Spanish and Portuguese, and also from the Caribbean, in what was referred to as the Black Gang, because you turned black because of the coal, right? That you would have to shovel, right? Like Fletcher did not directly organize sailors, to my knowledge, but the IWW did have many thousands of sailors in the IWW, including in Philadelphia. And the leader of the sailors in Philadelphia in the IWW was a Spanish man, an immigrant named Manuel Rey, who was also imprisoned by the federal government, but then deported back to Spain because he was not a US born and wasn't a citizen. He actually snuck back into the US later, took a different name, and lived for another 40 years in Philadelphia, in New Jersey nearby, and very possibly knew Fletcher, although I don't know that for sure. But one of Fletcher's best friends was a man named Sam Dolgoff, a legendary anarchist in New York City, who was good friends with this other guy, Manuel Rey. And so it's reasonable to conclude that they would have even hung out and laughed maybe in their later years about the fact that Rey had managed to get back into the States after being deported. But Fletcher generally organized dock workers, as far as I know. But considering the waterfront, who do you talk to? Well, you're talking to these guys who just came off the ship, right? And so it was very common for communication to happen, right? Whether it was formal efforts to unionize, unclear. But on the Philadelphia riverfront, because there was all sorts of small craft that wouldn't have been transatlantic, the Fletcher and other Wobblies did organize other people who worked in sort of related industries, not just loading, not just dockers, but also people who worked in ships, wharfside refineries, right? Those who work on small craft, moving between, tugboats and the like, right? It's essentially the extension of a single industry, transportation.
So there were two other questions before we end tonight. The first one says, is more of a point than a question. It's from Paul, who says, I believe that Paul Robeson at one point raised money for the Messenger from his concerts. So I think that's probably a very valuable point. And then Teo has come in, did Du Bois' politics allow him to write favorably about Local 8 and or Fletcher? And did Fletcher have a relationship with the communists? There's two questions here. After the demise of Local 8, when he moved to Brooklyn, or when he moved to Brooklyn.
So, the Messenger was a big fan, right, of Ben Fletcher and Local 8. They wrote about them regularly and sort of basically, including while he was in prison. So Fletcher had a good relationship with them. I guess, I sort of forgot the first part of that question. If you could repeat that.
Did Du Bois' politics allow him to write favorably about Local 8?
So at that time, Du Bois was not a communist, right? He actually, as he aged, became more radical. At that time, he would have maybe been called a sort of a left liberal. He had supported the war, but he was the editor of the NAACP magazine, the founding editor, called The Crisis. And the Crisis did write about how the IWW it praised the IWW for being anti-racist. Because the IWW's most successful anti-racist local was Local 8, it's reasonable to conclude Du Bois would have known about Fletcher specifically, but there's not direct evidence of that. But he did, on at least one occasion, praise in 1919 the IWW. Fletcher, Tyler's question about the communists, Fletcher hated the communists, right? There's a long answer to this that I will not bore you with, but I write about in several of my books. But basically, when the communists were born in the Soviet Union and then spread around the world, they tried to basically get groups like the IWW to join, right? The IWW actually briefly and initially was highly thrilled about the birth of the Soviet Union, but increasingly became wary of the more authoritarian nature of the Soviet regime, and the Soviets actually cracked down hard on anarchists and other left-wing people who they didn't like. Lenin famously wrote a book in 1920 that criticized anarchists, and others who weren't in the communists. For left-wing, they referred to left-wing extreme ultra-leftism, and so in Philadelphia specifically, the rumors spread that the dock workers loaded a ship of weapons for the whites in the civil war against the Reds in the Soviet Union. The US actively supported the whites, as did Britain. There's no evidence of this, but it disrupted Local 8. And Fletcher believed that basically this rumor was created intentionally to destroy Local 8 so that then the IWW would re-affiliate with the communists. There's no direct evidence of that either, although there's some circumstantial evidence. All I can say is that Fletcher knew what was going on much better than I did. I've actually tried to find, but
I'm going to try and hold it very, very briefly because we're now out of time, really. But Denise has written, thank you very much for a very interesting and well-researched talk. Could you tell us a little bit about your research? For example, did you contact the African American Museum in Washington, and what did you find there?
Well, that's a great museum. It didn't exist actually until very recently. I've done extensive research though in DC at the Library of Congress, which is the largest library in the world, and the US National Archives, which is the federal repository of records, as well as in many places in Philadelphia and other parts of different labor archives in the US. Most of my book are original documents, and the PM Press actually has a UK branch, right? And so you might be able to see that. I also received a lot of help from friends, right? Because after I started to do research, people sort of shared, and even since this book has come out, I've learned new information. I think I know most of what is available, but like I would lie if I said that it's everything, because The internet is actually an amazing new material. Sort of sometimes pops up, but you know, most of my research was done archival research, but also through newspapers and the like, historic papers.
So thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Really, really enlightening talk, and thank you for getting in touch with us. And I'd really love to have you back next year if you think you've got another topic you would like to cover. I think the transatlantic link is very important to us, particularly because we know as well that Tolpuddle martyrs went off to Canada after their treatment in Essex when they came back to England. Nigel, are you about? Have you got a slide advertising our next session?
Yeah, just to say thank you, Peter. That was really fascinating.
It was.
Excellent session. So thank you very much. The next session, if I can share with you, is the story of Jack Leslie, the Plymouth footballer picked to play for England, only for the management to discover that he was black and he got dropped from the squad. So there's a campaign to remember the story of Jack Leslie. So we're pleased to have them explain. And we're going to be joined by Jason Lee, who's the Equalities Education Executive from the Professional Footballers Association, to bring us up to date with the campaign to eliminate racism in football. So it should be a good session on the 8th of June.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Peter's put up a link. Peter, is that to your book? Is that? Yeah, Peter's nodding away, so that's good. So thank you all very much for turning out this evening. We look forward, hopefully, to seeing you on Tuesday, the 8th of June for Jack Leslie, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to welcome Peter back next year sometime for another talk. That was really, really brilliant, Peter. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I'd love to sit down and have a long chat with you about Dockers in London as well. So that'd be really exciting. Okay. So thank you very much, and good night, everybody.